The wind howled across the frozen landscape, carrying with it the distant sounds of the tribe preparing to leave. Old Kush sat hunched in the snow, wrapped in layers of tattered furs. His body trembled from the cold, but he barely noticed. He had lived too many winters to fear another. What he feared now was not the cold, but the silence that would follow. Though his eyes had long since failed him, his ears remained sharp. He could hear everything. The shuffle of footsteps, the murmurs of tired voices, the crackling of burning wood, and the distant cries of children clinging to their mothers. They were all preparing for the journey ahead, a journey he would not take. He knew what this meant. He had known it for a long time. A sharp voice rang out, breaking through the wind. "Get in, you worthless beasts!" Sitkamtoa, his granddaughter, was cursing the dogs as she forced them into their harnesses. The dogs whined and yelped under the sting of her whip, but she did not care. The trail was long, and time was short. The tribe had to move quickly before the storm set in. Kush sighed. He remembered when Sitkamtoa had been a little girl, tugging at his sleeve, asking for stories. She had been curious then, full of wonder and warmth. Now, she had no time for the past. No time for him. She was young, strong, and full of life. Life demanded her attention. The old had to be left behind. It was the way of things. The crackling fire beside him flickered weakly, struggling against the icy wind. He reached out a trembling hand to feel the small pile of wood beside him. It was still there. His last comfort. His last measure of time. One by one, the sticks would burn, and when they were gone, so would he. He withdrew his hand and pulled his furs closer, trying to hold on to whatever warmth he had left. He heard the sound of poles snapping, the chief's lodge collapsing into a bundle of hides and sticks. That was his son's lodge. The headman of the tribe. A strong hunter, a respected leader. Kush had been proud of him once. He still was. But now, he could not call for him. He would not. His son had made his decision, and Kush would not burden him with guilt. One by one, the lodges fell. The camp was disappearing, swallowed by the necessity of survival. The women and children packed hurriedly, securing their belongings onto the sleds. The men shouted commands, tightening the straps, adjusting the loads. The whiplashes cracked again, and the dogs howled in protest. The tribe was nearly ready to leave. Kush listened, knowing this was the last time he would hear these sounds. Then, footsteps approached. He felt a presence beside him. A hand, firm but gentle, rested on his head. He knew that touch. His son. "Is it well with you, father?" the younger man asked. Kush swallowed, his throat dry. "It is well. There is wood beside you." His son continued. "The fire burns bright." Kush nodded slowly. "Yes. The fire burns. The morning is gray, and the cold has broken. Snow will fall soon." "Aye. The snow comes. The people hurry. Their loads are heavy, and their bellies are empty. The trail is long, and they must travel fast." Kush took a slow breath. He knew what was coming. He had known it for days, weeks. Still, it did not make it any easier. "Go now, my son," he said at last. "It is well." His son hesitated. For a moment, Kush thought he might stay. That perhaps, just this once, the son would choose the father over the tribe. But he knew better. "Goodbye, father." The footsteps retreated. Slowly at first, then faster. Kush listened until he could no longer hear them. The camp was gone. He was alone. The silence pressed in, heavy and suffocating. The cold seeped deeper into his bones. He reached out again, his fingers brushing against the woodpile. This was all he had left. His life measured in sticks of firewood. He picked up one, carefully placing it on the fire. The flames flickered in gratitude, reaching hungrily for the fuel. He watched as it caught, burning brightly for a moment before settling into a steady glow. The numbness crept up his feet, then his hands. He knew the pattern well. First, the cold would take his extremities. Then, it would travel inward. His breathing would slow. His heart would weaken. His head would fall forward onto his knees, and then, nothing. This was the way of things. He had known it since he was a boy, watching his elders fade away one by one. The old must make way for the young. Life must continue. The tribe must survive. It was the law of life. And Kush did not fight it. Outside, the wind howled. Snow began to fall, blanketing the world in white. The last flames of Kush's fire crackled softly, holding the cold at bay just a little while longer. He closed his eyes and listened to the silence. To be continued. The fire crackled weakly, its flickering flames casting dim light against the vast, empty snowfield. Old Kush sat motionless, his frail body wrapped tightly in his furs. The cold had settled deep in his bones, yet he made no attempt to resist it. His fingers, now numb, barely grasped the last few sticks of firewood beside him. He understood that when they were gone, so too would he be. A deep silence enveloped him. There were no voices, no sleds, no whips cracking against the backs of dogs. The sounds of the tribe had faded into the distance, swallowed by the never-ending expanse of white. He was truly alone. His breath came in slow, misty clouds, vanishing into the frigid air. He had lived his life by the laws of nature, and he did not resent them now. He had hunted, built, and led his people. Now, he had been left behind, just as he had once left his own father. A gust of wind sent a fresh spray of snow against his face. He did not flinch. Instead, he listened. It was a habit formed from a lifetime of survival. Even now, his senses reached outward, searching for something beyond the howling wind. And then he heard it. A long, drawn-out howl echoed through the emptiness. It was close. Kush stiffened slightly, his grip tightening around a burning stick. He knew that sound well. The wolves had caught his scent. They had come for him. Another howl, closer this time. Then another. The pack was gathering. He imagined their keen eyes watching him from the darkness, their noses twitching in anticipation. He could almost see their shadows weaving between the pale, skeletal trees. Kush let out a slow breath. It was inevitable. The wolves, like him, followed the law of life. They were hungry. And he was weak. A shadow moved at the edge of his vision. His ears caught the faint crunch of paws on fresh snow. Then another shape, then another. The circle was closing in. He lifted the burning stick and waved it weakly. The fire hissed and crackled as sparks scattered into the air. The wolves hesitated, their glowing eyes watching cautiously. They were wary of fire. But not for long. The old man chuckled, a dry rasping sound. He had seen this before. He had been the hunter once, tracking the old and the weak, knowing they could not outrun him. Now, the roles had changed. He was the hunted. The fire was dying. The sticks were running out. The warmth was fading. He had little time left. Kush shifted slightly, feeling the weight of his years pressing down on him. He thought of his son, of Sitkamtoa, of the tribe traveling onward without him. He did not wish for their return. No, this was his fate, and he accepted it. Another gust of wind blew through the trees, carrying the scent of burning wood and human flesh to the predators. The wolves crept closer. A low growl rumbled through the stillness. One of the wolves, braver than the rest, took a cautious step forward. Its yellow eyes burned in the dim firelight, its breath rising in the cold night air. The old man did not flinch. Instead, he stared back, his face impassive. The beast hesitated, sensing something in the man's expression. There was no fear there. No resistance. Only acceptance. A second wolf stepped closer, emboldened by the first. Then another. The ring of bodies grew tighter, moving as one. They knew he was too weak to fight. They had watched from the shadows as he sat alone, abandoned, his body failing with each passing moment. Now, they would take what they had come for. Kush exhaled softly. He knew what was to come. His grip on the burning stick loosened slightly. His arms ached with the weight of age. He had no strength left to resist them. He thought again of the past, of the many hunts he had led, of the beasts he had slain. He had been young once, strong. But time had taken its toll, as it did for all living things. The fire crackled one last time, a final defiant flicker against the inevitable darkness. Then the flames died, leaving only smoldering embers. The last warmth of his world began to fade. The wolves sensed their moment. The first lunged. Kush did not move. A flurry of movement, the rush of bodies, the tearing of flesh. The night swallowed the sounds, the wind carrying them away into the endless snow. And then silence. The wind had settled into a soft whisper, carrying with it the final echoes of what had passed. The fire was gone, reduced to a few smoldering embers barely visible in the blanket of snow. The wolves had finished their grim work, their silhouettes vanishing into the night, leaving behind only a silent, still figure in the cold. Kush's body lay motionless, his furs torn, his hands frozen in their final position. Yet something stirred within him. He was no longer bound by the weight of his weary limbs. There was no pain, no cold. He felt light, as if he were floating, drifting above the earth he had known for so long. The great silence enveloped him, but it was no longer empty. Voices whispered through the wind, voices he had not heard in years. His father's deep, steady tone, his mother's gentle humming, the laughter of friends long gone. They called to him, not with words, but with warmth, pulling him forward. Slowly, Kush turned his gaze. The land stretched endlessly before him, the vast white tundra blending with the horizon. But in the distance, where the sky met the earth, he saw something new. A great river, its waters dark and still, waiting for him. He took a step and felt no resistance. There was no stiffness in his legs, no burden of age. He moved effortlessly, gliding toward the river bank. As he approached, a figure stepped forward from the mist, a tall man, his face familiar. It was his father. "Come," the old man said. "The journey is not yet over." Kush hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder. The place where he had sat, where he had waited, was empty now. The fire was gone. The wolves had taken what was left of his body. There was nothing to return to. He turned back to his father. The man smiled knowingly and gestured to the river. "It is time." The water shimmered under the pale moonlight. Kush stepped forward, his bare feet sinking into the icy current, yet he felt no cold. The river welcomed him, carrying him forward, guiding him away from the world he had known. The current was gentle, cradling him like a mother's embrace. As he drifted further, the river banks faded, dissolving into mist. He heard more voices now, soft murmurs at first, then clearer. They were familiar, echoing through time, calling him home. Ahead, the mist parted, revealing a vast land bathed in golden light. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and fresh earth. He saw people gathered by the river's edge, waiting. Their faces were known to him, ancestors, warriors, elders who had passed before him. They smiled, welcoming him into their midst. His mother stepped forward, her eyes filled with the kindness he had known as a child. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have walked a long path, my son." Kush nodded. "I have. You have honored the ways of our people," she said. "Now rest." A deep peace settled over him. The burdens of his old life melted away. He was no longer the abandoned elder left to the cold. He was part of something greater, an unbroken circle of life, stretching beyond the limits of the world he had known. The voices of the living faded behind him, replaced by the steady heartbeat of the land. He belonged here, among his people, beneath an endless sky. The wind rose again, singing softly through the trees, whispering the stories of those who had come before and those who would come after. The world would continue, as it always had. And Kush let it go. The wind whispered over the tundra, carrying with it the echoes of lives long past. The tribe moved forward, their sleds cutting through the deep snow, leaving a trail that would soon be covered by the falling frost. They did not look back. The old man had been left behind, as was the way of things. Life moved forward, and so did they. Sitcom Toa tightened her grip on the sled's reins, her eyes fixed ahead. The wind stung her face, but she did not falter. She had seen her grandfather's still figure wrapped in his furs, his fire burning low. She knew he would not rise again. It had been his time. Yet, as she listened to the wind, she swore she could hear his voice, carried softly through the air. The journey never ends. She glanced at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to pierce through the gray clouds. The spirits were watching, guiding them forward. She had always known this, but today, she felt it stronger than ever. Her people had walked this land for generations, their footprints fading into the snow, only for others to follow. One day, she too would sit by a dwindling fire, waiting for her time to come. And when it did, she would not be afraid. Ahead, the tribe's chief, her father, led the way. He had said little when they had left Kush behind, but she had seen the way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes lingered on the old man for just a moment longer than necessary. He had honored the traditions, just as his father had before him. Yet Sitcomtoa wondered if he had heard the wind as she had. A sudden gust lifted the snow, swirling it around them like ghostly figures dancing in the twilight. She shivered not from cold, but from something deeper. The presence of those who had gone before was strong tonight. She knew her grandfather had crossed the great river, that he had joined the ancestors beyond the veil of this world. But somehow, she felt as though he was still with them, watching from just beyond sight. The dogs barked, eager to move faster. The trail ahead stretched long and uncertain, but the tribe did not hesitate. They would find shelter before the storm set in. The young would grow strong, the hunters would provide, and the fire would always be lit. Such was the way of life. As night settled over the tundra, Sitcomtoa whispered a quiet prayer to the wind. "May your journey be swift, grandfather." The wind shifted, carrying her words away, beyond the snow, beyond the stars, to a place where the old still walked beside the young. The cycle continued. The tribe pressed on through the snow, their breath rising in soft plumes, their movements synchronized with the rhythm of the land. The great tundra stretched before them, endless and vast. As they moved, Sitcomtoa thought of the many before them who had walked this path, the hunters, the gatherers, the mothers who bore children on sleds, the fathers who built the shelters. They had left behind their wisdom, their strength, their stories. She thought of her grandfather's stories. He had spoken of the great river that lay beyond this world, where the ancestors gathered and waited for those who would come after. He had spoken of the stars, how they were not just lights in the sky, but the souls of those who had gone before, shining to guide the living. Tonight those stars burned brightly, and Sitcomtoa felt their presence in every breath of wind. They reached a sheltered valley as the storm began to rise, their temporary home for the night. The men quickly set up the lodges, while the women unpacked furs and blankets. Fires sprang to life, crackling with warmth and light, pushing back the encroaching cold. The smell of cooking meat filled the air, comforting and familiar. As Sitcomtoa sat by the fire, she let herself close her eyes for a moment. In the silence, she imagined her grandfather sitting beside her, as he had when she was a child, his voice deep and steady as he told his tales. She saw his weathered face, his knowing smile, his hands that had once been strong, now resting in peace. She would tell his stories. She would remember. And one day, when her own fire burned low, she would leave behind her wisdom, her strength, and her stories for those who would follow. The wind howled once more, but this time, Sitcomtoa did not shiver. She only smiled. The journey never ended. And so, the tribe moved forward. The end?